Welcome to the IASPM Research Seminar for this month. Each month, the seminar is hosted by a different IASPM branch. And this month, it's hosted by IASPM Benelux. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sydney, who's going to talk about what we're doing today.
Yes, thank you so much, Rupert and Catherine, for setting up the seminar series. And we are thrilled today to speak on behalf of IASPM Benelux, and we will do so with no fewer than 4 members of our research group named Amsterdance. And to briefly provide a bit of background to this group, because that's of course what you all came for today. Amsterdance, the Amsterdam Electronic Dance Music Research Group, was founded in 2020 by Dr. Oliver Sijp, Assistant Professor of Cultural Musicology at the University of Amsterdam, and Ian Poservina and me, Sydney Schelvis, who are both PhD candidates at the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis. We founded the research group out of a shared academic passion for studying electronic dance music culture, and soon found out that we were not quite alone, as new members at various levels joined us in our discussions, which also quickly surpassed the scope of Amsterdam. So far, we've had multiple students affiliated with Amsterdam's graduate, including Olle Beenhakker, Phoebe Janssen, and Jacob Tucker, and the last of these two will also be presenting their graduation research today. And over the past week, we have welcomed 2 new members to our group, Sophie Kofferman and Ella Pinkos, who are also present in the audience today. So we're looking forward to sharing perspectives with them and sharing ideas. And then, indicative of how Amsterdam transcends the scope of Amsterdam alone, we've also had multiple pioneering scholars in the field of electronic dance music studies speak in our lecture series so far. We've had Dr. Beate Peter from the Manchester Metropolitan University discussing her Labs Clubber project, and we've had so far Hillegonda Rietveld of the London South Bank University present on Spectacular Noise, Decades of Gabber, which provided a bit more of a Rotterdam-based perspective for us Amsterdam researchers. And our series continues this semester with lectures by Luis Manuel Garcia and Graham St. John, who is also affiliated with the University of Huddersfield. And these will take place online, so please keep check of our website. I will quickly show you what that looks like.
Well, she said she'll probably be with her parents tonight. That's why she wanted to do something tomorrow. So
somebody else is also interested in sharing this with their parents. That's very nice, because this is our site, the Amsterdam's Electronic Dance Music Research Group. As you can see, this is what we stand for, so you can have a look. I will post the URL in the chat shortly, and we will also post about upcoming events and about our lecture series. You can also just apply for the mailing list, of course, so you can stay up to date and see who we are inviting to speak here. I will post all of that soon in the chat, and you can contact Ian, who will take charge of that. And speaking of Ian, as an Amsterdam's coordinator, he will present his part of his research today, focusing on techno music. So I will now hand over this space in the DJ booth to Ian.
Thank you very much, Sydney. All right. I hope you can all see this. Good afternoon, and also a warm welcome on my behalf to everyone who found the time to join us here today. Since we're relatively short on time, I will jump right in and present to you my research project, which is called Exploring the Rhythms of Techno, a discussion of music, culture, and everyday life. My personal journey into the world of techno began almost a decade ago, and I can describe it as a steady evolution, first from tourist to migrant, then from consumer to practitioner, and eventually from enthusiast to researcher. The music is one of the reasons I left Luxembourg and came to Amsterdam in the first place, and is also one of the things that has kept me here ever since. But as techno is probably not as near and dear to everyone here as it is to me, I want to start things off with a short soundbite that gives you an idea of how the music that made me into a migrant actually sounds like.
Metrics authenticate.
The track I've chosen for this purpose is called Intel, and it's a fairly recent release by Detroit techno group AUX88, which I think is a good all-round example to what techno sounds like. When I first started discussing interests and ideas around techno with my research supervisor, it quickly became apparent that the layering of rhythms was at the center of my attention. Rhythms are not only characteristic to the music itself, where kicks, bass lines, claps, and hi-hats are continuously added on top of one another to create new patterns, but also to the wider sociocultural sphere of the music. At a rave, for example, it is not just the DJs and producers who create new rhythms for hours and sometimes even days. Dancers continuously move on the floor, off the floor, in and out of the venue, and this rhythmic cycles of bodies in return energizes and orients the space just as much as the beats coming from the speakers. With its grasp over the comings and goings of people, techno further influences and sometimes disrupts everyday life in the city. It creates cycles of events and festivals, travel and migration, as well as creative and commercial opportunities, all of them following rhythmic patterns. Similar patterns also play out on the translocal level, where different hubs and scenes all around the world respond to each other and in return trigger new cyclical movements. While pondering all these ideas and observations, rhythm eventually crystallized as an intriguing and promising starting point for my techno-focused research endeavor. As an underlying theory for my project, I employ Henri Lefebvre's writings on rhythm and use them as an interdisciplinary research tool to try and render the rhythmical layers of techno music and culture more legible. Lefebvre's writings are useful in that they first present rhythm as a multisensory concept and then rhythm analysis as the corresponding research practice. According to the sociologist, rhythms can be identified in the intersection of, quote, a place, a time, and an expenditure of energy, end of quote. Here, Lefebvre differentiates between natural and social rhythms, which are at times in symbiosis to create what he calls eurythmia, and sometimes conflict to result in what he calls arrhythmia. This conceptual framework thereby provides an interesting perspective on the notion of overlapping rhythmic patterns, and it can be applied to a vast array of particular cases, including musical, social, and historical ones. In his writings, Lefebvre further emphasizes that rhythm analysis is a practice-oriented technique, arguing that the rhythm analyst, as the person conducting the research, has to be grasped by rhythm first before being able to understand it, thereby pleading for a greater level of immediacy between researcher and researched. Considering the polyrhythmic nature of techno, it becomes apparent that rhythm analysis has the potential to identify particular cases of cycles and discuss how they affect the wider range of rhythms associated with the genre. Now, what does it mean to approach techno with the help of rhythm analysis? It certainly points to a lot of questions about the ways in which certain rhythms interact with each other and trigger mutual responses. Is techno music consciously playing with moments of eurythmia and arrhythmia in its layering of patterns, which switch between stressful buildups and rewarding drops? How does the music, despite being electronically created, affect natural rhythms in the bodies of dancers? And how does it relate to the rhythms of their social interactions? Which agents contribute to the interaction of space, time, and energy at a rave? And how does this rhythmic event relate to their everyday lives? Rhythm analysis will play a central role in making sense of these polyrhythmic dialectics, and it can potentially open up new ways of tracing the movements in and around electronic dance music culture. In the context of my research project, I will also examine the aforementioned relationship between techno and the city, which in my case is Amsterdam. Rather than focusing on human responses to the music, the discussion here will seek to feel the pulse of the city, so to speak, and trace the rhythms of techno across the urban playground. With my project, I hope to expand on existing techno scholarship and the wider field of electronic dance music studies. At the same time, the project also aims at providing a new perspective on the potential uses of the interdisciplinary research practice that is rhythm analysis. As the Amsterdam's research community grows, I also hope to provide valuable insights to my fellow researchers who all work on similar phenomena, yet approach electronic dance music from other promising angles. And finally, I hope that my work will contribute to the already diverse research community of the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis here at the University of Amsterdam. With this, I thank you all very much for your attention, and I will now hand back over to Sydney.
Yes, thank you very much, Ian. This was the first of 4 speakers. Please save your questions for the very end. Just write them down somewhere, and then we will have plenty of time, I assure you, to ask all of these questions. Moving on with Jacob Tucker, who is a writer and researcher currently working from London, but definitely equally part of Amsterdance. And he's especially interested in the history of drum and bass music and well, much more, but he can tell you much better. So here he comes, Jacob Tucker.
Thank you, Sydney. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming today. I hope you can all see. Yes. So today I'm going to be presenting my thesis research, Excavating the Bass. This was really an attempt to look at the sort of dominant narrative structures and epistemic foundations that UK dance music history has been based on thus far. It was an attempt to sort of pause and reflect on what is now 25 years worth of literature, of writing on UK dance music history. And it was very much precipitated by recent discussions. I don't know if anyone read Roshan Chauhan's letter to RA, recent discussions within the UK dance music media and industry about issues of erasure, about the existence of a sort of mythology, a consensus that is predominantly white, predominantly middle class, and doesn't do justice to particularly the contribution of Black, but also Asian Brits to UK dance music history. So here we have the sources that I've used, focusing more on the journalistic texts. I'm sure many of you might recognize some of these. It starts all the way in 1997 with Matthew Collins' Altered State, running forward to more recent publications, Joe Mugg's Oral History of Sound System Culture, with that lovely green cover there, and also Matt Annis's Join the Future, which came out, I think, 2 years ago. And what I was interested in is sort of tracing the existence of what is by now become a discursive formation, and which has been absorbed and fed back into sort of popular music journalism by a niche readership, and also looking at, you know, the fact that most of these texts have been written by white men. That's often been commented on, but how has that shaped the narratives? What effect has that had on the sort of ideas that we move forward with today. So firstly, what I did is I wanted to look at how UK dance music history has been ordered through time, how we structure, chronologically, chapter by chapter, the books. You see here on the right, this it's a recent image used. It's sold as a sort of poster. And you can see all of these multifarious interconnected threads that often people in dance music, they love to visualize this. But where do you start and where do you begin? It's difficult questions. And what I found was that genre has often been relied upon as this sort of subject that guarantees a narrative coherence to UK dance music history. This is most popular with writers like Reynolds, or I think we've got a bit of an echo there, so someone. Writers like Reynolds who sort of have employed what can be termed genreologies, elaborate sort of genealogies that trace evolutions of sound. And this has obviously been commonly been done with a sort of strategy of periodization. So for example, acid house begins in 88. By late 89, you have this sort of rave culture moving into hardcore rave, which then transforms into jungle, which is later replaced by a sort of sexier derivative of two-step garage, and so on and so forth. And this sort of structure of doing dance music history is really no different from previous forms of popular music history, even going back to classical music history, tracing evolutions of sound. And you see this with the evolutionary metaphors. Mutants, derivative, variants are very popular terms in the literature. The danger here is what is a sort of autonomizing of the music, and a focus upon the product or something that can be extrapolated. And this is also connected, as I've shown in my thesis, to the practice of music journalism and the need for music journalism to generate novelty and construct excitement and draw in excitement. Importantly, I looked at the issue of significance, both historical and musical. And in dance music, we're always sort of fighting against our detractors. Historically speaking, rave culture has not been seen as significant in terms of its importance. Dancing and dance culture has been relegated to the realm of mere pleasure and seen often as a distraction from the theatre of real political action. Similarly, the music lacks significance in the traditional sense. It lacks musical meaning. The lyrics, if they are used, are often employed rhythmically, and dance is at the center of course, dance music culture. So often the texts have been written as a form of sort of apologism. Why should dance music be taken seriously? And there's been an attempt to legitimate it in high discourse. And this has often been done continuing on from a practice of punk music journalism, looking at the political radicalism of UK dance music. Simon Reynolds, who I mentioned before, was a key figure in this. And he particularly sought to sort of translate music forms like jungle for high culture audiences, and get to the heart of why this is significant. But the issue here often came from this sort of extrapolation. The significance often lay in the existence of the communities themselves. And dance music journalism tended to mistake the wood for the trees. Turning dance music into a text that was capable of high discursive productivity was also a key project. And to do this, genre was relied upon heavily. The use of genre as a means of sort of tracing change. So something like bleeps and bass the argument was that, oh, this can be distilled by seeing the way it combines reggae, electro, and techno. And you constantly see this tracing of hybridization as a way of creating excitement around the music and fueling the idea of newness. And finally, I looked at what it means, what UK dance music history means in terms of British identity, because this is crucial to how the history has been written. For Black British communities, UK dance music has often been narrated as this sort of process of assimilation and also liberation. Liberation from what has been seen as a sort of restrictive Jamaican identity that doesn't do full justice to the experiences of second and third generation Black Brits. But also this coming together on the dance floor, this dissolving of difference that is so crucial to the enduring mythology of not just UK dance music, but rave culture more broadly: peace, love, unity, respect. And I wanted to sort of break this down and look more closely at those processes of assimilation, and not just look at this. Of course, it's important to celebrate this process, but it's also important to look at the ways in which the borders of Britishness are reinforced at these moments. And the history of jungle drum and bass is a great example of this. When you look at the reaction to ragga jungle, and when ragga jungle was a form of jungle which took particular influence from dancehall and reggae, and these ragga jungle events often got policed more harshly, and these are the sort of events where you see this delineation, this border happening around Britishness. The hardcore continuum is probably the most important genreology in terms of constructing a British counterculture. And what I mean by constructing a British counterculture is that UK dance music writers, who often were of a more leftist perspective, their writing has to be seen within a history of what Paul Gilroy calls left patriotism. Is the desire of British leftists to hold on to romantic notions of Britishness whilst also pursuing a sort of progressive or socialist agenda. And for many dance music writers, UK dance music has offered a means of overcoming a lot of the colonial past because of this multiculturalism that they see on the dance floor. What I wanted to draw attention to was the way in which these perspectives are situated. And often the desire for this counterculture has not been reflected in the actual development of the history, in how Black British creators have been treated. And there's also a problematic element in the sense that a performative Blackness, which is particularly based around this Jamaican sound system culture, has often actually, the white gaze upon this performative Blackness has actually been restrictive for Black British creators, particularly in the case of things like the hardcore continuum. So that is the gist of my research. You see here a great photo of Fabio and Groove Rider, who were two foundational DJs. And this is in 1988, and these guys are still DJing today. And what's really interesting is that we're now seeing groups like this and a lot more journalistic interest. And there's a movement towards this concretization. And what I hope to do with my research is really try and pause and see what we can do differently going forward. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Moving on to our second Amsterdance related graduate. And again, please save your questions for the end. We will have plenty of time for these questions. We're moving on to a second Amsterdance graduate who graduated recently from the University of Amsterdam, if I'm not mistaken, but she can tell you. She is from Berlin and graduated in musicology then. to continue research in cultural anthropology and still looking at music in urban settings. And in this case, she looked specifically at Berlin. So I'll hand over now to Phoebe Janssen.
Thank you very much, Sydney. Real quick, gonna share my screen. Yeah, as Sydney already said, I'm going to be talking about Berlin today, specifically kind of about the reappropriation around the wall and why Berlin's former border acts as a continuously fertile ground for the city's club culture today. So up here, I have these 6 images of really just a teeny tiny subset of clubs in the city that were and still are. It's a bit of a mix of everything, and I'll just take you through them. The first one in the top left corner is called Tacheles. It's for this specific location is in Mitte. They recently moved to Marzahn, which is a district a bit further out of the city center. And the building it was hosted in was a former department store and already in temporary use in the German Democratic Republic, actually. And just after the wall fell in the early, like mid-90s, it became a club. And afterwards, it kind of turned into a cultural hub that also had parties, but the clubbing aspect wasn't the central key element anymore. And the same counts for their new location. Then next to it, the red brick building is actually the new home of the club Griesmühle, which used to be in Neukölln in a warehouse there. But now, under the new name Revier Südost, it's in a former brewery complex in Niederschöneweide, which is in the southeast of the city, quite a bit further from the border, really deep into kind of the middle of the east there. And what you can see on this image is maybe a fourth of the entire area of that former state-owned brewery. And yeah, they're trying to make it work even during these pandemic times. Then next to that is the bunker, which, as the name says, and the image also quite obviously states, it's a former air raid bunker, and it's in the theater district of central Berlin, of Mitte. It's kind of in between Friedrichstraße and the University Clinic, the Charité. And it's been, amongst the bunker, many other things. It was a food storage space during the GDR, and it was actually one of the earliest and biggest clubs in the 90s in Berlin. It was running from 92 until 96 and was then bought by a kind of urban cultural development company in 2001, and it now actually hosts an art collection by Christian Boros and also some events that are mostly related to the art sector. Then in the bottom row on the left-hand side, we have the dance floor of the Club Tresor. Tresor is the German word for a safe, like a banking safe. And this is also located in Mitte. And they got the name from their original location, which was in the basement of an old bank building. They've now moved to a different place, also in Mitte, which is a former heating plant, actually. Then next to that, we have Berlin's probably most infamous club, Berghain, which is also in a former heating plant. It's in Friedrichshain, another border district. And the first parties from the people that started this club actually happened at Bunker in 92. And they then had a predecessor to this club that started in 1999 in an old railway station, also in the district of Friedrichshain. And then the last one is the E-Werk, which refers to electricity plant. And as you can see, there's still quite a lot of the former apparatus visible. This is also in Mitte near Checkpoint Charlie, and it was that former electric kind of substation, and it was running as a club from 93 until 97, and it's now a very broad scale commercial events venue. So whether this is like some catering event, a gala, anything can really happen there. The thing that all these 6 and many, many other clubs in Berlin have in common is that they're in former border districts, and that those buildings were mostly state-owned before the reunification process started, and that they are characterized by the temporary use of these buildings, and that they might also have a bit of an undetermined future. And this is something that's quite characteristic to a lot of spaces in Berlin. It's a big city that doesn't really have one clear center, and the kind of inner city border obviously didn't allow for a new center to grow after the Second World War either. So there's a lot of land that is asking for resignification for new purposes still now, more than 30 years later. And there's a lot of empty industry and power plants that were previously state-owned by the German Democratic Republic. So this just general availability of space kind of coincided also with the rave and club culture coming from the US and the UK in the late 80s and early 90s, that kind of resulted in a boom of basically a club and rave scene in Berlin that's still kind of going on to this day. And when you look at this little map, it's just an excerpt of kind of central Eastern Berlin. You can see that the black line marks where the former wall went and border. And you can see quite a few little red crosses. They're referring to a few clubs. This is by no means an exhaustive list. There's plenty of clubs that have opened, that have closed, that have moved locations. This is just to give you an idea where most of them are. Because as you can see, they're not all over the entire city, as you maybe expect from a city that's called a clubbing mecca. But they're all very much located close to the border, most of them in the eastern part of the city, and most of them also in this somewhat walking distance area that stretches from around Alexanderplatz to alongside the Spree. And there's a colloquial term for this called Clubmeile, which the translation is pretty straightforward. It's a club mile. It's not a literal mile, but as I said, it's somewhat walkable. And it goes from Mitte through Kreuzberg to Friedrichshain. And it hosts almost all of the clubs. So when I started working on my thesis, I was wondering, why is it exactly there and not all over the city? And this is kind of when those former power plants and the general border area come into their own agency. Just after reunification, this agency called the Treuhandanstalt, or short Treuhand, was put in charge of kind of rearranging the state assets, maybe reprivatizing or privatizing, figuring out what to do with all those things that used to be owned by a country that was no longer in charge of them and then later ceased to exist as well. And they were acting until around 94. It was quite a controversial agency. Not everybody agreed at the time, and also not today, with how they handled things, because their legislation and the just general way how they acted wasn't always clear and understandable. But what they had was a permit for these spaces that had yet to be redetermined under the label of a gallery with an open bar. And this allowed a whole lot of people that maybe had an experience in music, maybe had an experience or like a background in organizing events, but also just groups of friends that were in the mood for a party, to essentially open their own club wherever, whenever, as long as it was something somewhat art related. And there was a bar somewhere. So to conclude this, there was kind of a coexistence of an eagerness to reappropriate the city after the division, and especially that former border area and all those old abandoned buildings that still persist today, as we could see in the Revier Südost building that has been standing there since 94 and out of use, and now it's a club again. Then the incoming wave of club and rave culture from the US and the UK. And with that, kind of this image of electronic dance music cultures being harmonious, being open, and being able to welcome each other and encounter the other beyond East and West, but also queer crowds, fetish crowds, and by now tourists. And yeah, in my thesis, I basically explored this seemingly endless availability of space and why the city can still thrive on that, because that process of reassessing what buildings are used by whom and how is not yet over. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Phoebe, for this very interesting talk of your paper. Again, all the questions, please keep them for the very end. We'll have plenty of time to answer all of them, I'm sure, because we only have one presentation left, and that is actually by myself. So I will set that up now. There we go. So welcome everybody who joined us later on, and thank you everybody who is still here. This is the last one, so if you want to wake up and get some water and be present again for the last one, then you're more than welcome, because these are the last dances that we'll have on the dance floor. And I am stoked to actually be the last one presenting. And I'm presenting my PhD research project, which is titled Dancing to the Beat of Gentrification, How Electronic Dance Music Moves the City of Amsterdam. And in this doctoral research project, I study how movement is a common denominator for music, dancing, community building, and this location, in order to investigate the relationship between electronic dance music and gentrification in Amsterdam in the post-COVID era. So electronic dance music's relationship to gentrification is not yet fully understood. In most places in the Western world, the music first emerged on the periphery of the city in old warehouses and vacant lots. Well, in Berlin, it was mostly close to the wall, as we just saw, but not in Amsterdam, because as electronic dance music's popularity grew in the late 1980s, its sounds started to move people on dance floors downtown too. In Amsterdam, the first clubs to emerge, most famously the Roxy and the IT, were located at the heart of town, in present-day tourist hotspots that we can see here also in the red central square in the Canal district of Amsterdam. Yet, the upsurge of tourism in the late 1990s to mid-zeros caused for these clubs' demise. The picture we see here of the flower market is actually taken from where the Roxy used to be until 1999. With this Disneyfication, the image of Amsterdam as a city of sex, drugs, rock and roll, and possibly electronic dance music was swapped for one associated with cheese, tulips, and Rembrandt. In the city center's metamorphosis, there seemed to be no place for nightlife, and niche scenes instead nested on the city's fringes. When, in the early 2010s, Dutch DJs thrived on the global mainstreaming of electronic dance music, Amsterdam became a locus for its culture. The Amsterdam Dance event alone has, since then, drawn over 300,000 visitors annually. The 5-day event is spread over 200 locations, which we can see here on this very dense map. Taking it back to my own map, which is a little more insightful maybe. Some of these locations are located in the city center, such as the multi-purpose music venues like Melkweg and Muziekgebouw aan het IJ, which are again in the central area, and ad hoc sites like Zuiderkerk, which normally functions as a church, and the W Hotel, which is, to no one's surprise, a hotel. Yet the overwhelming majority still resides on the outskirts of town, and most clubs that surfaced as a result of the upsurge in electronic dance music's popularity in the 2010s did so on the perimeter of Amsterdam. For instance, we can see Radion and Warehouse Elementenstraat, which were both founded in 2014, and even more recently established clubs settled even further from the heart of the city. For instance, Jack in 2018 and Lo-Fi in 2019. These are very far from the Canal district. The national measures installed to combat COVID-19 from early 2020 onward meant for a de facto shutdown of club-based nightlife. Some clubs even had to close permanently. For instance, the school, which is located quite west on the map. While others tried to make the best of the situation by hosting live streams like Shelter, which we see here. These, however, only at best amplified the desire for clubbers to crowd the dance floor once more. And those clubs that actually subsisted were in most cases filled at capacity in the brief periods that the measures allowed them to, like we see here at Warehouse Elementenstraat. And this demonstrates the intense knaldrang, which is a lockdown-born Dutch neologism, which freely translates to the urge to dance your heart out. And it is indicative of nightlife's ever-present popularity despite the COVID regulations. And fun fact, the knaldrang was actually elected Word of the Year in Dutch-speaking Belgium, to also include the B part of IASPM Benelux, because we have the Netherlands and Luxembourg represented. So from this knaldrang, let's move back to the topic of my research, nightlife and gentrification. Because on first sight, it seems as if pre-COVID electronic dance music cultures fell prey to the dislocating forces of urban gentrification. For those of you unfamiliar with this term, I will first briefly explain it now. In the process of gentrification, things, usually neighborhoods, if we talk about urban gentrification, are improved in order to raise their value. Now, this overall sounds like a good thing. With regard to neighborhoods, it is actually doubtful whether it is a good thing or not. Because what usually happens from the very beginning is that buildings that are cheaper to rent or buy because of their desolate location, for instance, are used for low-budget cultural events such as raves. The benefit of a desolate location is that there are less residents around them to report nuisance. That is also true, of course, for these places. And these places themselves can revitalize an area by inviting people who otherwise would have never set foot there to have a positive experience there. If the attraction continues to grow, the area usually opens up for other cultural activities. In the next phase, artists and students who are traditionally closer to the cultural development that takes place, but shorter on money, settle and live in the area even further. By this point, such an area is prone to be noticed by young urban professionals looking to settle affordably, tourists looking for a city's rough edges, and real estate agents looking to make a profit out of both. Once demand for this hot and happening area succeeds the supply of housing, residents who originally settled there because it was affordable now see their rents inflated. Not only does this have the potential to dislocate these residents as they cannot afford the cost of living anymore, it also culturally homogenizes an area. Only stores, restaurants, bars, and venues that cater to a larger and thus more profitable mainstream audience can survive this urban economic development. And this is part of the process called urban gentrification. Now, so far, we have seen that more recently an independent club was founded, the further away from downtown it did so. If we take a quick peek at the map, and this time include the index that actually originally came with it, then we can immediately see that there seems to be a direct correlation between the expense of living and the spatial distribution. That is, venues not willing or able to submit to higher rents and stylistic homogenization, as a consequence, are forced outward, moving their musical scenes along. So there is a sort of centrifugal pull. And this has become indicative of the overall topographic distribution of musical sound in Amsterdam. Under the weight of ever-increasing rents, venues in the city center tend to program more accessible musics, thereby attracting larger audiences in an attempt to make ends meet. Meanwhile, derivatives of sonic cultures once housed downtown, including electronic dance music, now subside on the city's peripheries. And however, to consider nightlife as solely a victim of gentrification might be too straightforward. From my earlier research on the conjuncture of nightlife and gentrification in Amsterdam and New York, both conducted in 2018, I perceive a ripple effect around sound's movement in club culture. That is, speakers move air, moving air becomes music, music moves people on the dance floor, dancers build bonds, spawn scenes, create communities, and communities move around town. In this regard, nightlife itself might have played a crucial role in the urban dynamics of Amsterdam as well. Tracing the ripple back from socio-economic transformations to musical sounds, questions of agency come to the surface. Like, how did nightlife fall prey to complex conjuncture of neoliberal market forces that underpin gentrification? Conversely, how did nightlife's nomadic nature play a part in the process of gentrification? And of course, key to my research, how do both forces collide when nightlife opens up again in the post-COVID era? These questions call for a historicization of the present as it unfolds. By mapping how the sounds of electronic dance music move through the city in the post-COVID era, I aim to reveal previously concealed patterns of distribution of cultural and financial capital in Amsterdam. So this is my plan for my PhD project. If you have any suggestions, comments, feedback, thoughts, whatever, please share them with me via my email that I will drop soon in the chat. And with that, we have come to the end of our presentations. So I will hand over back to Ian, who will be moderating our discussion, for which we have about 44 minutes left.
Yes, let me start by thanking all of our speakers for taking the time to talk about their research today. And I would like to open the floor for questions. So if you have a question, please give us a signal by raising your virtual hand or dropping a message in the chat function, and I will keep an eye on the chat throughout the remaining discussion.
It's as silent as Amsterdam nightlife.
We have Nicola. Nicola, please go ahead.
Hello. Hi. It's a question for Sydney. It's in that diagram of how, well, first of all, thank you for all the very interesting presentations. In that, towards the end of your presentation, you had this diagram which kind of expands from, sound waves, music, dancing, community. In my experience, I've been a bit in my experience, I've observed that dance music that the word community seems to get thrown around an awful lot. However, in my experience, from what I observe, dance music organizations, communities seem to be extremely inward-looking and insular and hermetic. How exactly does that link happen between dance and community, and then the further cycle, the furthermost circle?
Right. Thank you for your insightful question. Well, the way I perceive it, or the way I am going to sort of research this, is by way of movement. So there's a parallel there in the sort of movement then from the sound to the communities. And indeed, the notion of communities is thrown around a lot in these cultures. But what I perceive is that there's a vast difference between the various electronic dance musics, and that is why I actually start with the sounds of them. Because if we look at, for instance, drum and bass culture in Amsterdam, it's rather nomadic. It doesn't have a sort of settled or established club where it will always return to. It has various festivals in which the music sort of crystallizes and manifests itself, and various club nights that return to some clubs. But if we then take techno, like what Ian studies actually, you can see that there's, well, maybe 4, 5, 6 actually dedicated clubs in the city. So they're sort of more permanent, more settled, and they're easier to trace of where these communities bond and actually get together and expand again, because new techno clubs might pop up probably further towards the periphery of the city. Whereas with other musics like drum and bass music, it might seem more at random at first, how this music sort of bonds these people, bonds these communities in constantly changing spaces. But I hope to map this and sort of find the patterns within this. How come that sometimes they will be in the West, sometimes they will be in the East? I think there's also sociological factors tying into this, because from what I've observed so far is that with drum and bass, there's a slightly younger audience, perhaps more student-based audience. So you could argue maybe there's less money, maybe they live in relatively cheaper student housing, which will tend to be further towards the periphery of the city as well. Does this have an impact on where they will meet and where they will actually host their events, and in so where the music actually manifests? And that's why I start from the musical movement. So really looking at, okay, what kind of electronic dance music's out there, to how do they ultimately form these communities and where do they do so? What does that say?
Thanks.
Any further questions? Sorry, can you hear me now? We have a question in the chat from Julie, who's asking, what do we think is the future of dance music going to?
Well, who wants to take that one?
Well, maybe let me go first then. I've come to notice that when I read articles about the music live streams that happened and been set up since the beginning of the pandemic, for instance, I often read about the assessment that they don't really work, don't really send over the real thing, and that people in the chats, for example, just communicate about wanting to go back, wanting to have the real thing. And to a certain extent, I agree. But at the same time, I really enjoy the fact that there are so many people dedicated to keeping the music going no matter what, even if it means that everyone has to have his little rave experience at home. So I think that the live streams and the way they are going on is actually a very positive sign for electronic dance music, even in these times of COVID.
I mean, it's a different question depending on where you ask it. I'm in London, and the clubs are all still open right now and have been since July. But in terms of the future, I'm not sure if this is a COVID-related question. It really depends on the country. I know that Berlin, there's much more of a sort of recognition within public institutions, within government, that this is sort of a culture, like a respectable culture. I think here in the UK, we're still sort of in the process of fighting for that recognition, or that, you know, dance culture is a serious or a worthwhile culture. So yeah, it's really a question for every different sort of city even to answer, I think.
Yeah, maybe to add on to that, it depends on the city type of comment that Jacob just made. What I noticed in Amsterdam, like in the past year and also before that, is that a lot of clubs are kind of venturing into a more interdisciplinary world, so that there can also be art exhibitions, that they might start their own radio station, and that people are kind of, they're less scared of staying in a specific lane or a specific genre maybe. And I really enjoy that aspect. I very much like that it's more of an, yeah, if you're in the mood for this, go ahead and do it. There's a room here that you can make your own.
All right, then I think we have a question from Alex Yu. Please go ahead. And please remember to unmute yourself.
You're unmuted. I think your microphones might not be working though.
Still not working, I'm sorry. Maybe you can use the chat to type in your question.
Is it working now? Great.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, thanks for the presentations for all of you guys. And I actually have questions for Tucker. And I want to highlight one point that you mentioned on genreology, where you mentioned about genre relies upon a subject providing narrative coherence. Can you elaborate more on this point? Because what makes me puzzling is because I thought but the ideas of a genre, the formation of a genre is both a discursive formation, but also as a sonical or materialistic level of formation, where there's a certain kind of sound that makes certain genres that to give a name for, or somebody came up with like a definition of a genre, but then you seems to realize on the subjectivity of the ideas of genre. Can you elaborate more on this?
Yeah, it's something like that I had to grapple with a lot, because as you said, there is this sort of, it's like with any discourse, it's constructed but also real. And obviously, as you said, with genre, it has that sonic material dimension that drum and bass does sound different to techno. I think what my research was looking at more was the process of codification. Specifically in UK dance music, you sort of have this constant interaction between the music press, and particularly I was looking at sort of Black British music. So genres like, you know, we still have to speak in the world of genre, but jungle, drum and bass, garage, grime, dubstep, these all have names. Often these names don't come from the people who create it. And often the names can be repurposed. So I spent a lot of time looking at the transition from jungle into drum and bass. And what was interesting is that for a lot of people, they're different music. Jungle is a different music to drum and bass. But for someone like Brian Bell Fortune, who wrote All Crews, he calls it jungle drum and bass because he sees it as a sort of continuous culture. And what I found was that there was this tendency towards pigeonholing or subgenre. So you have ambient jungle and you have gangster jungle and all of this. And I think maybe you're right, that the genre is less of the issue than the way that genre operates in order to sort of codify. And you see this often with Black British music, that it, you know, with grime, for example, it came sort of organically within specifically East London, and through pirate radio, and often, you know, working class kids in tower blocks. And at one point they just read in the media, oh, so it's called grime. And it's interesting with grime and jungle because they both have sort of, you know, racist connotations, but in other ways they're, you know, reclamations of these terms. So I had to be you have to be careful not to obviously see it as genres are always imposed upon music cultures. But what I really was interested in is that interaction between press and music cultures. I'm not sure if that's if that's helped
I mean,
at all.
I think it helps to deconstruct a bit more. I think yes. I don't have anything to add on, to be honest.
We have a question for Jacob in the chat function. And how do you see this relationship going forward? wants to know. Is Anna?
That's a really good question. Because as I mentioned earlier, there was this sort of letter in 2019. It was actually, no, sorry, it was 2020, I think. And it was a letter to a resident advisor who sort of this problematic, well, they're not problematic, but they're a ticketing platform and media institution, which has its own, that's a whole nother conversation. But Roche, who wrote the letter, he basically outlined this erasure of deep tech and UK funky that happened sort of towards the end of the noughties. And it was a real sort of forensic takedown. And he brought it out around the time that the Black Lives Matter protests were sort of hitting their peak, especially in the UK in around July 2020. And it really sent a sort of shockwave through a lot of the UK dance music media. And as you see with, I think, a lot of media organizations now, there's obviously been a lot more efforts towards like representation and trying to combat erasure, which is obviously positive. But I do think that there also needs to be a look at the sort of more material relations within UK dance music, particularly towards things like pay. Often you see Black women on the cover of magazines, but we don't see, you know, are they being compensated for their work? And, you know, who are running the PR organizations, the booking agencies, all of these things behind the scenes. I think that needs to be addressed with regards to, you know, racism, but also sexism. All of these things, it has to be addressed behind the scenes as well as in the media and as well as in, you know, that representative front. I could go on, but I'm sure I have to wrap up there.
Great, I think that's a great place to finish. Looking forward, I'd just like to thank everybody for their contributions. It's a really coherent and great set of papers, and I can recommend to you the whole research group, the Amsterdance group. Get in touch with them if you want to get involved in that kind of area. Thank you in general to the Benelux branch, and we look forward to seeing you all next month at the next IASPM research seminar.